This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Ghannam.
And I'm Jamal Dajani.
Jamal, we have a really outstanding show today, and we're going to be talking about the Israeli and Palestinian elections with one of the foremost analysts, in the region, Diana Buttu. It's a really excellent interview, and we'll be getting updates on that. And, sometime afterwards, we're going to be covering a lot of other things that are going on in the world right now, whether it's the pandemic, mass shootings, all things going on related to kind of the domestic challenges that we're facing in this country. But back to the Israeli and Palestinian elections, Jamal, how can I say this? It never ceases to amaze me, even in the New York Times and the Washington Post, how blatantly and disturbingly racist the coverage is of Palestinians who reside in Israel and have Israeli citizenship, how they get labeled, how they get spoken about, and at a time when Palestinians may decide the next Israeli election, the way they get labeled as Islamists and Arabs. No mention of Palestine, and I'm sure we'll hear Diana's take on that.
Yeah, first let's listen to Diana, because this interview happened before the results, which we will talk about the results, that just came, started to come, and I think the final numbers will come on Friday.
Right.
So here is Diana Buttu. The Palestinian Legislative Council's elections will be held on May 22nd this year. Elections for the presidency will be held on the 31st of July, and the Palestinian National Council of the PLO on the 31st of August. Also today, March 21st, Israelis vote in their fourth parliamentary election in just 2 years. Once again, the race boils down to a referendum on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Joining us from Palestine to discuss this and more, Diana Buttu, former legal advisor to Palestine Liberation Organization Chairman Mahmoud Abbas, and Palestinian negotiators. Welcome again to Arab Talk, Diana.
Thank you, Jamal. It's always a delight to be on your show. Thank you.
Let me begin with the Israeli elections, because it's happening today. So what I've been reading, that the vote count will be delayed due to coronavirus regulations, but it seems that Netanyahu is winning, according to some Israeli reports. Is this the case, or is it too early to tell?
Yes, no, he's definitely winning. And in fact, Jamal, there's kind of no way for him to lose. And what I mean by this is that Netanyahu is now Israel's longest serving prime minister. Many voters only know him, especially younger voters, only know him and support him. And what I mean by there's no way that he can lose is that there has been no effective opposition. We saw in the last election, when we saw Lapid come together with Benny Gantz, that when they joined the coalition with Netanyahu, that instantly Netanyahu managed to play Gantz like a fiddle, and we saw the complete capitulation of Gantz. So in the eyes of many, there really is no alternative to Netanyahu. But I think it's also important to bear in mind that there is no alternative to Netanyahu because they're all the same. They're all very much holding on to the same political program. And that political program is one of continued apartheid, continued racism, continued colonization of the West Bank, continuing the siege on the Gaza Strip, and making sure that Palestinians are forever under Israel's rule. So whether that individual is Netanyahu or Gantz or Lapid or Bennett or Saad or any of these figures, the political program remains the same. The only thing that's changing is the name.
So according to the Israel's newspaper Haaretz, Israeli election, this time Arabs are the target. That's the headline, not the subject of disinformation. Unlike previous Israeli elections that saw misinformation spread against Arabs in Hebrew, this time Israel Arabs are enjoying bespoke propaganda in Arabic, and even Likud is reaching out to Arabs. And look, Netanyahu is promising direct flights from Tel Aviv to Mecca, even though, Saudi Arabia's international airport is in Jeddah. I mean, what's going on with this?
Look, I think that's actually a huge misinformation campaign. And I do want to say that we are always the targets. We're the targets of in one way or the other. And I'll break it down for you. So Netanyahu, as I was mentioning, it doesn't matter who the person is, just the name change. And the reason I say this is because over the past decade, if not 2 decades, there really has been no real opposition to Netanyahu. The only opposition that has been formed in 2015 with the formation of the Joint List. And as you know, the Joint List consists of 4 political parties that have come together, anti-Zionist political parties that have come together that largely encompass the vast majority of Palestinian voters. They managed to get the lion's share of Palestinian voters. Now, you'll recall, Jamal, that in 2015, when the Joint List was actually formed, that Netanyahu, in one of the rare moments of raw Netanyahu without being polished, went on Facebook and in a broadcast said, hurry out, go out and vote because the Arabs are voting in droves. Now, at the time, you'll remember that statement met with a lot of condemnation, including at the time, the US President, Barack Obama. But since that time, the Joint List has been his target, and he's trying to bring down the number of people who vote for the Joint List. He's trying to reduce that number. He did that in the election 2019 by installing cameras in a lot of the polling station in order to intimidate voters and to suppress voters. He did it again in the other elections where he kept saying, he started this theme of what is it that the MKs have done for you lately. And this time around, what he's done is he has promised that good things will happen to the Palestinian community if either they vote for him or if they don't vote for the Joint List. Now, to be clear, he's not expecting to be getting lots of votes from Palestinians. But what he is hoping to see is the Joint List will no longer be as strong. And on this, he's correct. And the reason that it's not going to be as strong is because what was once a party which was once a movement that consisted of 4 political parties has now turned into a movement that consists of 3 parties, with the 4th party, namely the Islamic movement, breaking off on its own. What that means is that both the Joint List and the Islamic movement will need to be able to pass the threshold of 3.25% to be able to get seats in the Knesset. And anybody can add up the numbers and do it. Even if voter turnout is the same as it was in the last election, we're still going to see a drop in the number of seats for the Joint List. But given that there's been this split within the Joint List, we are expecting to see even lower voter turnout. So this is precisely what Netanyahu wanted. He's not at all expecting Arab votes. He doesn't even care for those votes. All that he wants to see is that there's no opposition. And the way that he does that is by making sure that the number of votes that are cast for the Joint List actually decrease in number rather than increase in number. And on this, he's going to be very successful.
And the turnout has been less, because that's what I've been reading, that the turnouts of Arabs is much less than the year before.
Absolutely. And that's exactly the problem, is that even if it were to stay the same, which it won't, the Joint List will have lost at least 1 seat in the Knesset. But we're already seeing that people are very upset with the dissolution of the Joint List. And so the numbers have already dropped. I'm expecting to see much lower numbers than even not just the last election, but the election before. But I want to say something, Jamal, about this whole issue. It is false to think that Netanyahu is actually trying to go after our votes. He's trying to destroy the Joint List. And I say this for a reason. if he genuinely wanted to do something for Palestinians who hold Israeli citizenship, he doesn't need to woo us over. He could have easily done it. He's the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history. And instead, this is the same prime minister who put forward the Jewish nation state law. This is the same prime minister who put forward the Kamenetz law, which allows for the demolition of Palestinian homes. These are Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. Demolition of their homes. This is the same prime minister who has made racist statement after a racist statement. This is the same prime minister who has entered into an agreement with the Jewish Power Party, the party that supports very strongly Meir Kahane, and who talks about Baruch Goldstein being their hero. There are so many things that he could have done, but he's chosen not to. Instead, what he wants to see is the dissolution of the Joint List. And on this final point, that it's the same Likud. Just 3 days ago, one member of Likud came out and said that Palestinians who are citizens, who hold Israeli citizenship, are fifth column. He used that term, fifth column, and that we take our orders from Iran and from the Palestinian Authority. And just 2 days ago, Smotrich, another man who is very closely allied with Netanyahu, came out and said that Islam is a religion of violence. And these are not people who care to have our votes. These are people who seek our suppression and oppression. And to think that somehow Netanyahu is going to turn over a new leaf is to believe in the tooth fairy.
So if Netanyahu wins, we could possibly see the likes of Itmar Ben-Gvir becoming a Knesset member. I mean, now this is in broad daylight. The Meir Kahane was outlawed. The membership of his party, and now they're back in the Knesset, or the Israeli parliament.
Yes, precisely. So Itamar Ben-Gvir, so that people are aware, this is the head of the Jewish Power Party. This is a man who, in Purim, during 1 year in Purim, dressed up. He's an adult. He dressed up as Baruch Goldstein and is on tape as saying that Baruch Goldstein is his hero. Remember, Baruch Goldstein is the man who massacred 29 Palestinians in February in 1994 in Hebron as they were praying in the Haram Ibrahimi Mosque. And this is a man who makes he doesn't even make any excuses for, and is certainly shameless about his position regarding ethnic cleansing. He is somebody who it just relishes in the fact that he supports Goldstein and is an offshoot of the Meir Kahane party, the Kach party.
Right. Moving on to Palestinian elections, there have been several false starts and broken promises. The Palestinian Legislative Council last met more than a decade ago. President Abbas has been in office since 2005. Do you think that Palestinians are hopeful and looking forward to change, or that they are just drinking the Kool-Aid and they're not serious about this and nothing is going to change based on their previous experience?
Well, it's a great question, Jamal. So the last time that the Palestinian parliament even met was 15 years ago. It was in March of 2006. So they haven't even met since 2006, much less passed new legislation. Abbas dissolved the parliament in December of 2019. And so we've actually had no parliament since 2006, but then formally dissolved since 2019. It's a mixed bag in terms of whether people are hopeful or not. Look, on the one hand, I really do believe that political movements can only grow either through a process of elections or by doing something, about showing that something is being done, that they don't grow just through stagnant, through lack of activity or through lack of elections, that you need to get people motivated and give them hope. So it's important to have elections. The problem with these elections this time around is that there's a lot of suspicion that they won't happen. I think they might, though. But more importantly is that there's a bigger question of how are these elections going to happen, and what is it that people are actually voting for? To be clear, this is not going to be an election about strategy or goals. This isn't going to be about, do we believe in ending Oslo or coming up with a new strategy or supporting BDS. It's not what this is going to be about. It's really going to be about changing the faces, if at all possible, because people are sick of the same faces over and over again. And Abu Mazen knows this. And because he knows this, he's put into place a number of presidential decrees, which are what he uses when there is no parliament. He's passed so many of them. In fact, he's passed more presidential decrees than there are laws in the Palestinian Legislative Council. And a few of those decrees really focus on who is eligible to run in these elections. And, I'll give you some of the restrictions. As I'm sure you know, Jamal, there is no political parties law that's in place in Palestine. And what that means is that the only political parties that can operate are the ones that are already pre-established. Mm-hmm. What that means is that the only time that we can get people to be involved in the political process is only around election time. And as you know, political work doesn't just happen around election time. You need to be creating a base and a platform for years in advance of any election. And yet that doesn't exist in Palestine. Then add to that he's placed a number of restrictions. The first restriction being that there's an age limit. Anybody who's under the age of 28 is not eligible to run in these elections. Another restriction is that any person who was formerly a member of the PLO Central Committee is not eligible to run. The reason he's doing that, on the face of it, it seems normal, but it's because he's kicked out so many people and he wants to block off any opposition. Another thing that he's done is that any person who is currently an employee of the Palestinian Authority must resign from their post in advance of running. And as I'm sure you know, it usually works the other way around. You run, and then if you win, then you resign from your post. But in this case, he's seeking a guarantee that a person resigns before they even run. Now, what that means is that for many people, this is their only source of income.
They can't afford it.
What's that?
They can't afford it.
And they can't afford it. Add to that another financial matter, which is that any list that comes together has to come up with a $20,000 fee. Now, given this environment that we live in with Corona and so on, all of these restrictions are really designed to make sure that nobody is allowed to run who is an opponent of Abbas, who's opposed to him. So while elections are important, I believe in them, I'm also very well aware that what he's trying to do is tailor-make this election and make sure that the outcome is the outcome that he wants to see, rather than the outcome that we want to see.
So the recent polling that was done in December shows that Hamas leaders and Mahmoud Abbas are very unpopular, with
Correct.
61% wanting the latter to resign and only 31% believing he is the best candidate in his party. Several other figures, including the imprisoned Marwan Barghouti, command far more support among the public. These are the results of a poll conducted by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip between December 11th and the 14th of December. So how accurate is this? Do you think, for what I heard, everything he's doing because he knows that basically he's not popular, and hence you've mentioned something important, like for example, I was reading that the Fatah, the Palestinian movement, has sacked one of its most prominent leaders, Nasser al-Qadwa, and stripped him of his party membership. And of course, al-Qadwa is the nephew of former Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. And he and Abu Mazen never got along. And he was seeking to create a party, the National Democratic Assembly. So what you're saying is none of these people are qualified. If I mean, how is Nasser Qudwa going to run when he's basically has all these restrictions? Marwan Barghouti is in Israeli jail, so maybe he will win from jail. And recently I was like looking to see also former Palestinian Prime Minister Salam Fayyad also said that he's submitting a list of independent candidates. But who's left? I mean, for one thing, these names are old names, so it's kind of recycling some old names. And then you're saying if you're under 28, and we know the Palestinian population, vast majority of Palestinians are under the age of 28, who's left?
This is the $1 million question, Jamal. This is it. This is exactly the $1 million question. He kicked out Nasser Qudwa from Fatah because Nasser wanted to establish a different Fatah list. He wanted to have a Fatah list that he views as being much more representative of Fatah, and include people like Marwan Barghouti and others who aren't exactly enamored with the way that Abu Mazen has steered the party. And this is why he ended up getting kicked out from it. And another matter that I forgot to mention in all of this is that Abu Mazen has also established something called an elections court to oversee these decisions about who can and cannot run. In short, what he's really trying to do is he's trying to cut out any opposition. And given that he's also trying to limit the number of the age of people who can vote, he's really looking to make sure that it's only his survival and that's it. And so this is why I predict that we might have legislative council elections, but I'm fairly certain we're not going to have presidential elections at the end of July. In terms of who is it who's left, this is why it's so important for us to have this political parties law, because had there been a political parties law, there could have been an attempt to actually bring people together, form a new political party, and start doing that political work that's necessary and gain that experience. But instead, what he's done is any political work that has been done has been suppressed. I'm sure you were well aware of the fact that he has suppressed opposition, he's imprisoned opposition, and so on, because he doesn't want to see any alternative come through. In other words, Abu Mazen wants to be reelected again, and he wants to be given the legitimacy of being reelected again and the mandate of being reelected again. And he knows that the only way that he can do that is by eliminating all of these other people, including all of these old names that many of them are tired, and it's really time for a brand new generation. But Abu Mazen knows this and instead is going to continue to try to eliminate everybody else so that it looks as though he's really the only viable candidate.
The question is, why go through all this exercise? Is he coming under pressure from the Biden administration? Is it the donor countries, Saudi Arabia, the EU? Why is he doing this? I mean, he's already kind of charted down the route that for his re-election.
Yes, it's a combination, Jamal, of things. So all of the public opinion polls are showing that the number one issue that is affecting Palestinians is the split between Hamas and Fatah. Hamas and Fatah both are well aware that their political survival is at risk and that their movements are not growing. There's also pressure that's being brought to bear from the Biden administration, as well as from the donors, particularly since December of 2019, when he ended up canceling or dismissing the parliament. And so it's a combination of things. It's domestic considerations, it's international considerations, it's donor considerations. As all of these things come together. And so he's going through the process. And I will say, I do believe that it is important for us to have the ability to vote. The question is, what are we voting for? And where I'm very concerned is that we're not voting on ideas. We're not having a referendum about Oslo or about where we should be going in the future. It's simply just you copy paste the same old names from before, and just shuffling the names somewhere along the way. That's it.
So looking forward, Netanyahu is going to get elected.
Yes.
Abu Mazen will get re-elected if the elections go through. Same old, same old. What's for Palestinians to look forward to? I mean, nothing has advanced under these two, and what's going to happen?
I think that now that box has opened when it comes to elections, this is where it needs to be kicked even wider open and made sure that we are given a space to be able to really change and vote even wider than just simply the head of the who's in the legislative council or the president. I don't think the presidential elections are going to happen. And I think that this is where a lot of movement building needs to happen. Look, Jamal, for far too long, because of the way that Abu Mazen has held on to power, there hasn't been a lot of he's crushed any form of opposition. And I think now that this space has been opened up is where people need to be working to try to open up that space even further to make sure that we have a viable opposition and are able to move forward. Otherwise, you're absolutely right. We're going to be trapped in the same cycle over and over and over again. When it comes to Netanyahu, yes, he's going to win the election. He is going to be the next prime minister once again. And we are going to see a coalition that is the most right-wing coalition, because the whole landscape, by the way, is right-wing. Meretz, which is the only presumably left-wing party, and even that I question, is going to be decimated. It probably won't pass the threshold, which means that it won't have any seats in the Knesset. And so the only shape of government is going to be a right wing, and then that is split into two of those who support Netanyahu versus those who don't support it. So yes, we will continue to see that Netanyahu in some shape or form, whether he's prime minister directly or the ideas of Netanyahu continue to be in shape or form. That said, it's still so vitally important for us to be organizing and pushing and demanding for change. And this is why, for me, I think it's so vitally important for us to be really making sure that we are able to organize and push for a different PLO, something that is actually representative, that isn't just looking at the West Bank and Gaza in some sort of silly power sharing agreement, but instead that's looking at what does this mean for Palestinians as a whole? What does it mean for us as a people, as a community, as a society?
Last time you and I spoke on this show, we talked about the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Yes. And recently, Israel canceled the VIP for the Palestinian Foreign Minister, Riyad al-Maliki. And what is this? Is that like because of, they said, a report said because of his position on the ICC? Is this a knee-jerk reaction, or is this a message to Abu Mazen that he's next, and things will change on the ground as far as movement and traveling abroad, and because of the ICC?
I have to say, so I don't like the VIP system. I don't think any of us like the VIP system, and I'm not somebody who's going to be advocating for the VIP system. I think that we all have freedom of movement, or we all should have the right to move freely. And we shouldn't be going down the path of advocating for the right of some to be moving freely versus the right of others to be moving freely. So I'm somebody who blanket believes that all of us should have the right to movement because it is our country. That said, this decision is exactly highlighting the system of occupation that exists. That even those who were part of the privileged class, once you cross Israel, you are no longer part of that privileged class, and you become like every other person in Palestine. And so this is the message that they're saying, is that they're showing their muscles and saying to the Palestinian Authority, you better worry because you are next. You watch what you're doing, because slowly we're going to be taking away your privileges. And so this is why I think it's in a way it's very not in a way, it is very telling about what Israel is about and how it wields its power. It's about trying to control, and it wields its power by demanding submission. If you don't submit, then you don't get privileges. But if you do submit, then you do get privileges. And I don't know whether this is going to resonate further on up or higher up, but I already know that Israel is using its proxies, such as the United States, to exert pressure on the Palestinian Authority to abandon any claim or demand for investigation against Israeli war crimes. So it's already happening that they're wielding their muscle. It's just a question of time before they eventually turn around and get to Abu Mazen and say, you're the next target, just in the same way that they turned on Arafat and he became their target as well.
Last question before we leave. Israel is getting all these accolades that it's exceeding all expectations in vaccinating its population against COVID. Meanwhile, I read a report that's like the situation is very dire in the West Bank, in Ramallah, the Bethlehem, other places. People are dying. The hospitals don't have basically any beds left. And yet, like I said, everybody's praising Israel, that they're doing such a great job, and nobody's talking about that 50% of the population that Israel controls is not receiving any COVID except for those who work in Israel, like Palestinian laborers.
Correct, yes. So they shouldn't be getting any accolades whatsoever. Back in the 1950s, when Palestinians who were inside 48, when they were living under Israeli military rule, one of the few ways that they were able to access healthcare was through Israelis viewing this in a boomerang effect. So, for example, if there was an outbreak of cholera, cholera just doesn't confine itself to Palestinian communities. It can boomerang into Jewish Israeli communities as well. And that was when Palestinians ended up getting healthcare, was if it could boomerang into Jewish Israeli society. And similarly, we see that the only people so far that have gotten the vaccine, and after a great deal of pressure, by the way, are the Palestinian workers who come in and either work in the settlements or work inside 48 on a daily basis, for that same reason of the boomerang effect. But, there's a bigger issue here, which is that Israel is under an obligation under international law to actually provide vaccines and to make sure that they deal with the outbreak of epidemics and contagious diseases. These are all things that are enshrined in the Fourth Geneva Convention. And Israel knows very well that this is part of international law. But what they've done is they've hidden behind this false pretext that somehow the Palestinian Authority is its own governing authority, which it's not. If it were its own authority, then Palestinians would be able to move freely. They'd be able to hold on to the population registry. They'd be able to add people to the population registry. They'd be able to do a whole import things, but they don't. And we're seeing it now at an absolutely critical stage, Jamal, that all of the 200 ventilators that are in Palestinian hospitals are now in use, 100% of them. And doctors are now making decisions about who gets to be on a ventilator and who doesn't. These are the decisions of who gets to live and who gets to die. And the fact that we have to even look to international law rather than look to humanity and ask ourselves, is this really the country that should be getting all the accolades when they're allowing Palestinians to die because they're refusing to give vaccines to them, while at the same time giving vaccines to countries like Honduras and Guatemala because they've moved their embassies illegally from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. I think we need to have a reset of what it is that gets accolade, that gets praise and accolades, because this is definitely not a country that should be getting accolades for the things that it's doing. It's the opposite. It should be condemned for not giving Palestinians the vaccine rather than being praised for vaccinating so quickly.
Diana Buttu, thank you for sharing your analysis on Arab Talk, and we hope to speak to you very soon.
Thank you, Jamal. It's always my pleasure.
That's Diana Buttu, foremost political, analyst in the region, speaking about both the Israeli and the Palestinian elections, how they relate, and in the current context. And you're right, Jamal, she didn't quite have the most recent results, which put Benjamin Netanyahu and the opposition in literally a dead heat right now without any clear winner.
That's right. So the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Likud, that's his party, they still emerged as the largest party with the majority of the vote, which she predicted, counted in Israel's, this is an unprecedented fourth election in 2 years. And we might be heading to a fifth one.
That's
if these results don't change. So Netanyahu still does not have a clear path to a 61-seat majority needed to form a coalition. So the vote count, as I mentioned earlier, is expected to continue through Friday, and then we know the exact numbers. So then you have the anti-Netanyahu bloc, which is comprised basically of the left, the right, and centrist factions, who also are shy of a majority. So that's what you're talking about, the dead heat. And now the biggest winners, and this is the important thing, which actually Diana spoke about, are going to be the fascist Kahanists who will have seats, regardless whether Netanyahu stays, he doesn't stay, if there is a coalition government or not. They will have a number of seats in the Israeli Knesset. And of course, when we talk about the Kahanists, they are the followers of the notorious Meir Kahana, who founded the Kach party. Before that, he was in the United States. He founded the Jewish Defense League, the JDL, then went to Israel. And for the record, both Israel and the US have declared Kach, the Kach movement, to be a terrorist organization. So they got banned. However, now what happened, they repackaged themselves.
That's right.
And will be returning to the Knesset under a new umbrella. And of course, what Diana alluded to, this should not be a surprise to anyone, knowing the history of Israel and the Zionist movement. And if we're just going to pick any couple of names, we can go and say, well, you got Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir. Both were charged with terrorism, so they were terrorists.
That's right.
Linked to the King David Hotel bombing and the Deir Yassin massacre and the assassination of the United Nations peace negotiator, Count Bernadotte, among other crimes. They became leaders of their parties, and they became prime ministers. So when people, in a way, say, "Oh my God, the Knesset is being taken over by fascists," and
they've always had fascists.
That's just kind of like, there are the old fascists or the old terrorists who became prime ministers, and there are the good fascists, according to Israeli media. And then the bad one that everyone talks about is the followers of the Meir Kahana, and I'm sure 10 years from now they'll be the good ones. So
right. But the interesting thing for me, Jamal, is that there is a Palestinian Arab party that may in fact be, and we put this on quotes, be put in the position of being the kingmaker, and that's the party that's headed by Mansour Abbas, who's a dentist with the Druze community that is being targeted and has been targeted in the Negev desert with having their villages destroyed, and they've had decades of dispossession. He's in control of a party that controls, I think it's 4 or 5 seats right now, Jamal. And ironically, they could be in a position of deciding who the next Israeli prime minister and the control of the Knesset will be. It's a very interesting play right now.
Well, actually, not just this party, and you're talking about the United Arab List Party.
That's right.
Headed by Mansour Abbas. And then you have Naftali Bennett's Yamina also on the other side. So between these two small parties, and until they to declare their support to either Benjamin Netanyahu or another bloc, we won't know. So you're right. So both of them could play, and that's why you have almost the dead heat, because if they shift their weight, let's say, and back Netanyahu, Netanyahu will be prime minister forever. I mean, he keeps playing this game
for the sixth time.
Yeah, and so you're right. They have an important role, and that's where behind the scenes the negotiations will begin. Probably they've already have begun, but definitely, throughout this week, and especially since the numbers will be finalized on Friday, the negotiations will begin. And in the past, Netanyahu emerged as the winner. So I'm not going to discount him pulling the same thing again.
Never discount the opportunity for an opportunist. And Benjamin Netanyahu is an opportunist. He's being charged and is in the middle of a trial for massive corruption. And despite that, he is easily capable of winning a sixth term and delaying, being held accountable for among the worst corruption in Israeli political history.
Of course, Diana Buttu also talked about and analyzed what's going to happen with the Palestinian elections. First the legislative, then you're moving into the presidential ones. Should they happen? And that's why there is that question mark.
Should.
But if and should they happen, especially the presidential ones, Mahmoud Abbas put himself in a position to easily win, because he passed all these different restrictions, who can run and who cannot run, and you have to pay $20,000 to put your name, and if you are a member of the Palestinian government, you have to resign, which is kind of ludicrous. Like here in the United States, if you are a senator or a congressman or a congresswoman and you run for presidential elections, you resign after you win. But he's asking his opponents to resign now, so they won't be receiving any salary, and a lot of them, they need that salary. So there are a lot of tricks and things in a way to kind of assure him a win. But anyway, I mean, she spoke about that. I want to move on to a couple of other topics. One quick one, Jess, is that a new Gallup poll was released has some interesting numbers.
Yes, very interesting.
And that relates to the Palestinians and Israelis. And you have, for example, 53% of Democrats now they're opting for more pressure to be put on Israel. And this is up from 43% in 2018.
It's a big jump.
And it is up from 38% a decade ago. So there's a big shift. And we've seen the AIPAC and the Israeli lobby trying to fight this, because you and I talked about it when they went after Bernie Sanders in the 2020 primaries, because he proposed making U.S. aid to Israel conditional on how they treat Palestinians. So that was kind of like the first signs of this, has become bothersome to them.
Well, Jamal, but it's a pretty dramatic percentage change in a short period of time. And you have a combination of contemporary American Jewish community, younger generation, not feeling connected to Israel, to the Israeli regime and the apartheid practices, kind of distancing themselves from it. And then you have progressive elements of the Democratic Party, which are getting more powerful and are more powerful now. So that shift to 53% we will only anticipate growing and getting even larger as time goes on. It seems like J Street and AIPAC and the pro-Israel forces in the United States are really facing a reckoning as time goes on and as the demographics within the Democratic Party change.
And two more percentages here. Also, according to the Gallup poll, this is across the not just the Democratic Party, but the majority of Americans, 52%.
That's right.
Now favor a Palestinian state, while 37% oppose it. So that's also a major shift.
And Jamal, if you look at the ages, I'm sorry to interrupt, if you look at the ages of those who oppose a Palestinian state, you'll be not too surprised to see that there's significantly older people who have bought into the old kind of narrative of the Israeli regime. So things are changing pretty rapidly.
Yeah, definitely on the Democratic side, and that's what kind of why the numbers basically it's a narrow majority of Americans, which is still significant because 80% of Republicans sympathize more with Israel compared with just 10% who sympathize with Palestinians. So that's where you see the major difference between the Democrats and then you should, as you've said, the progressive elements of the Democratic Party and the youth who are actually supporting a Palestinian statehood. Unfortunately, of course, I looked at the different questions. They don't talk about, they should it's kind of like based, we support the Palestinian state, you don't support Palestinian state, but they don't talk, for example, about the equal rights and BDS and apartheid and perhaps asking the question, what about a one state or a binational state? That I think I'll be very interested to hear something about it. You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco, 89.5 FM. Of course, we're going to talk about this subject that keeps repeating itself, Jess.
Terrible, Jamal. 2
mass murders a week apart, and Congress is still debating gun control. There's still, it's just like we go through this, it's like a deja vu all over again. Every time we have a mass murder, they start talking about, gun control, we got to ban semi-automatic weapons. And of course, the Republicans, they start screaming, you're going to strip us of the Second Amendment, and then we go nowhere.
That's the history in this country, Jamal. And it seems like the Republicans like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley have their talking points after so many people have been murdered, both in Atlanta and in Boulder, Colorado. We know, for example, that, reasonable gun control, which means everybody should get a background check, and, banning assault rifles, which are weapons of war. These two simple changes would dramatically reduce, and it's been shown empirically. We have the studies to support that, would dramatically reduce the amount of mass murders and killings occurring in this country. Even though the majority of Americans, Jamal, looks like over 75 to 80% of Americans, Republicans and Democrats and independents, support reasonable gun control, you have the extreme elements of the Republican Party, Ted Cruz, Mitch McConnell, Josh Hawley, primarily in the Senate, who say these things. And as you said, you're going to take away our Second Amendment rights. And the thing that I find most appalling is hearing Ted Cruz talk about how the Democrats are making this a political issue. Because the Republican solution, Jamal, when there's a mass murder, is more guns. That's their answer. If we have more guns, if we make guns easier, if more people have guns, then we will have less gun violence. There's no data anywhere in the world, even in the United States, to support the idea that more guns reduce violence. There are more guns in the United States, Jamal, than there are people in the United States. And yet the Republicans keep shoving it down our throats. And again, even though 80% of the entire population want gun control, it's those people in the Senate who believe in the filibuster, who believe in white supremacy, who believe in this idea that the few should govern the many, are holding the entire country hostage right now.
So this whole debate is really for show because, knowing the makeup of the Senate, you have the Senate is split 50-50.
Right.
It leaves the Democrats in need of 10 Republicans
or
to
change,
pass any major,
or get rid of the filibuster.
Any major legislation.
Right.
They're not going to get that. And it's just like, we're going to wait for another catastrophe to happen.
Well, I do want to say
again
something.
for this debate, because I was looking at it whether President Biden can use his executive power,
right,
and bypass this, because we're not going to get anywhere through the Senate.
Well, unless they decide to get rid of the filibuster, and there's some talk going on that they may negotiate not getting rid of the filibuster in exchange for getting the 10 Republicans to push through some kind of reasonable gun control. And I think the easiest thing to do, Jamal, is just to make sure that if you buy a gun, you have to register it and you have to get a background check.
Well, not just to buy the gun. Why do you need to have an automatic or semi-automatic gun for hunting? Why do you need to have a machine gun for hunting? I mean, that's actually
a weapon of war.
A weapon of war, to me, that's more important. I want to speak briefly just about also something that happened between these two horrible mass murders. Both of them are horrible, it's terrible. The one in Atlanta, Georgia, Atlanta, and of course Boulder, Colorado, the most recent one, and how the media has been covering both of them. Do you know that after the recent murder, a mass murder in Boulder, on Twitter and other social media outlets, the word Islamic or he is a Muslim started to trend. They were trending.
Right.
It didn't happen, for example, after the mass murder in Georgia, Atlanta, saying he's a Christian or didn't, like, all of a sudden the recent perpetrator, Ahmad al-Alawi al-Isa, who was identified as the shooter on Tuesday, because of his name, because of his background, the discussion became like, okay, he's a Muslim, he's an immigrant, although he came to this country very early. And the coverage on the Atlanta one was more like, he had a really bad day.
He had a bad day.
And
Right.
He was seeking to eliminate a sexual temptation prior to killing 8 people. This is according to the sheriff's captain in Georgia, who said that in a press conference. I mean, isn't that disturbing?
Well, it's more than disturbing, Jamal. It's part of the pattern of how the media wants to continue to throw out that old canard, that old narrative that it's an Islamic terrorist, context, that anytime someone who has a particular last name or who looks a particular way, they're going to throw that label on it. What we do know so far about the perpetrator and his alleged crimes is that he had serious mental health problems, and that is continuing to be downplayed in the media. And let's not forget, as you said, Jamal, we always need to keep this in mind. When will they start saying things like, well, a Christian fundamentalist committed the crime in Atlanta, Georgia? We would never hear something like that, as you said. So the bias in the media continues. Let's wait till all the information comes in. I will just end this segment by telling you, Jamal, that I think because of the pandemic and the isolation and everything that's been going on in the world, I'm afraid that we're going to be facing down a lot more of these catastrophes in the coming months. I'm very worried.
I'm worried too, and the focus should be again on, we've been talking about this, on gun control, Mental illness also is a major issue. But if you still, if in this country, if you can still purchase a weapon much faster and easier than obtaining a driver's license, we're going to see more of these crazy
Jamal,
acts.
it's worse. It's easier to buy a gun in this country than it is to register to vote. So put that in your analysis, that we make it more difficult to vote in this country than we do to buy a weapon of war.
Very sad indeed. You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco, 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to access all of our previous shows, and we'll talk to you next week.
We'll see you next week.